how much work do you do in sketchbooks?
Not as much as I used to. Not, I mean, it's very random. I mean, I've got a sketchbook right now that I'm mostly filling up with paper cutouts because I got very excited about that. But it'll go back to drawings at some point. And then I have another sketchbook that I do strips in once in a while. I've got a million little side projects on the go. And I think people sometimes think like I work on them every day, but not at all. I mean, it depends what's on the schedule.
Yeah.
So today I've got a little gallery show coming up in a couple of weeks, and I'm finishing up some paintings, so that will fill up my time.
Mhm.
I won't have much time to do anything on the side, but the minute that's done, I'll probably spend some time working in the Dominion sketchbook, or I've got or working on my paper cutouts or whatever I'm working on because it'll be a little freer.
What do you mean by paper cutouts? What is that?
Like Matisse's cutouts. Do you know those cutouts?
Yeah,
So
you
I'm
do.
just cutting pieces of paper out and gluing them down onto other pieces of paper.
Okay. Are you still doing the stamp diary?
Very infrequently, but yes.
Mhm.
I've did that for like many years, and then I found myself lagging behind where I didn't care that much. And so when I feel excited, I'll do a page or two.
And have you ever done so much work in your sketchbook that when you have to go back and do your more like finished work, you find you have to break the habits that you have developed from working so loose in a sketchbook?
It's actually happened completely. I can't do that kind of, I can still do the full style if I have to, but I don't really work that way anymore. I just did an illustration for the Globe and Mail newspaper the other day, and I did it mostly with magic markers because that's what I work with now. I pull out the brush when I want something to look particularly nice,
Yeah.
but I've got like a more expedient style I use now that I'm more comfortable with, that I like better in a way.
Well, speaking of nothing lasting, I don't think you should work with Sharpie markers. That's not gonna.
Well, they won't. That stuff won't. Yeah, but I'm not worried about the future. It's like, let's be honest. Who survives into the future? It's like there's some hope. You might get, it's like I have a belief that the work I'm doing is important. I wouldn't be doing it if I wasn't, if I didn't think that. And I believe that after I'm dead for some time here in Canada, there will be some interest in my work.
Mhm.
But, being for the ages, that's really pretty dicey. It's like worrying about whether your artwork will survive a couple of hundred years. It's like chances are, except for a handful of oddball collectors, nobody's going to care.
Yeah, I felt that when Harvey Pekar died. It was like, wow, a giant has left, and
Yeah.
just like the day after he died, he was twice as dead. Didn't and
Yeah.
now ask a young cartoonist who Harvey Pekar is; they don't even know. So it
No.
doesn't matter.
Well, it goes fast. I mean, who lasts 100 years? Like
Yeah,
only, enormously important artists, and that's a crapshoot too.
yeah.
I mean,
Well,
we're talking about Matisse. I love Matisse. And another artist I really love is Morandi. Do you know Morandi's work? A painter? Anyway, Morandi's an enormously important painter and very famous. I didn't even hear his name until I was like 60 years old or something. So it's like fame is very arbitrary how it operates.
yeah. Well, I think when you're young, I'm speaking for myself, I guess, but when I was younger, I my motivations were sort of like, let me leave a mark on cartooning, like I'll like make a name for
Yeah.
myself, have a lasting legacy in this art form. Now my motivation is to just take care of my family. I mostly just want to take on work. Every day I want to have stuff that I need to work on, and the goal is to just keep working and keep bringing in whatever money I can to support my wife and child. And that's it. I don't care if like when I die, if all this stuff just disappears. That's not the point of it.
Yeah, I guess I do want the work to be remembered. It's important to me. I think about it. I do. I worry about like my house that I put so much effort into that it was like as soon as I'm dead, some new people will buy it and tear everything out, which seems very likely. I worry about I think I worry about the house more than I worry about like all the original art, sort of, because I know the original art will get scattered and forgotten or whatever. But the house feels like something I'm working on that I want to be permanent after my death. And that will really depend on whether anybody thinks it's important.
I'd like to visit your house. I wonder if I can
You
pull
can
that.
come anytime you like. You know, the problem is I'm in Guelph and people come to Toronto, but people very rarely make the trip out to Guelph. It's
How
only an hour,
how far away is it from Toronto?
45 minutes by car. So
Okay.
it's not ridiculous. Chester visits once in a while.
Yeah. Is he's still in Toronto, Chester?
Yeah,
Yeah, I'd love to see that place. And Nothing Lasts, the title comes from the stained glass window that you have, right?
it's the other way around, actually.
Oh,
I think I named the comic first and then realized I liked that pessimistic saying.
hmm.
And I believe it. It's pretty true.
Do the neighbors frown at you when you put that pessimistic saying?
Can't read it well from outside. It's
Okay.
mostly read, it reads well inside. And the neighbors are very nice, actually.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I'm lucky that way. I'm always really careful about neighbors and that, like, I try not to get to know them for
Mhm.
fear that they'll be a nightmare. But these people next door actually seem pretty nice.
Well, that house might become like what the Thurber house is in Columbus, where it's just the Seth house and people can come.
Crossing my fingers,
Yeah.
crossing my fingers that I'm even considering, like, as you know, if I live another 20 years or something, figuring out some way to donate it to the university or something.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you turned Palookaville from a comic book to an actual book, weren't you a little bit nervous about that? Like now I got to quadruple the content that I would normally have to come up with.
I don't think I what actually, you know, when Chris Oliveros asked me if I wanted to do that, my initial response was I didn't. And the reason I didn't is I didn't want to give up the format of a comic book. I was still at that point felt emotionally attached to the idea of the comic book.
Yeah.
Um, but almost as soon as I changed into the book, I realized I liked the book better. I
Yeah.
was never using the comic format properly. It was always just a way to serialize a longer story. And, you know, the best comic books are self contained. The ones where you just read and then you put it's like that world of serializing stuff. It really was like part of an era when people were using comic. You had to make a bit of money. So people would buy your comic to subsidize your graphic novel.
Yeah.
That's a different world now. Nobody does that anymore.
That's right. Because
And
the sales would go down so far, right? Because people would be like, well, I don't,
yeah,
you know, Palookaville.
but back then they were the readers were altruistic. They knew they were supporting you too. And then they'd buy the graphic novel when it came out too.
Yeah.
But that world's totally gone. Um, and I don't really miss it. I mean, I like working in the hardcovers. It's like they're also I'm using those in a strange way too.
Yeah.
People will complain like I'm getting part of a story in this $40 hardcover, and it's true. But I mean, I don't look at it that way. I look at that book as like my this is the chance where I put out. I'm just working on a body of work. I'm not producing a serial comic book anymore. I'm not. It's like I'm just an artist who like does this stuff, and then I have a publisher who lets me put out this book periodically, and this is what I put in it. And if you're interested, buy it.
What was so interesting about? I know the answer to this, but I'm curious what you would say. Like, what's so interesting about the kind of Beaches storyline, short order, that you felt like you needed to return to it? Was that because it was a big moment in your life of losing your virginity? That
Yeah, it's an enormous part of my life. But I mean, I think it's also I automatically knew even after I finished that story that I would be doing it over again someday
oh
and trying to do it right. I
yeah,
sometime about I don't know 10 years after that, I took the comic and I cut it apart and I laid it out and I figured out how I would tell it if I did it again. And I was still at that point planning on kind of using that artwork in some way,
mhm,
but adding in pages and blah blah blah. And now I look at that and I think like, well, that's a mess too. That reworked version, that layout, it's like I would never even spend a second on that. But then I started to think about, oh, I got this idea of I would do a very um, sort of meta version. I would do a book where I publish the original book stories, then just like comics with covers and everything, then have the reworked layout, and then have like the how it should be told.
yeah.
But at some point, it just got too old. I didn't care anymore. And this is just happening in the story because I'm covering my life. I've hit that moment. It's an important moment in my life. It has to be dealt with, and it's as I'm working through Nothing Lasts. You probably notice I'm spending more time on each memory,
Mhm.
and that's just because I find there's if you think about anything, there's more and more to talk about, and I'm giving myself more space.
And you have more recall for things that weren't weren't so
I
distant.
had more recall for the earlier stuff too, but I just didn't feel the necessity to plug it in. I could have dragged that stuff out too. I mean, that stuff, that early part where I'm talking about childhood and playing around like in the at the racetrack under the grandstand and stuff. I have an enormous storehouse of memories from that childhood period. I could have gone into like great detail about my parents' marriage and the amount of fighting that was going on in the house, or about Christmas, or it's like I was moving fast then because I thought that Nothing Lasts would be 80 pages long. That would just be a sketchbook thing, and then that would be the end of an exercise. Now, if I were to start fresh, I'd probably spend like 20 pages on like, you know, the house I was born in easily.
There's that great disturbing scene though where your mother comes in and uses the baby voice, you know, that is so perfectly placed, I feel like, within the story that's like, oh, like something's going on here. I mean, that we're going to find out more about. I mean, I know that I've already read so much of you talking about it before, but it's just so it's just a moment in the it's kind of couched in between this other story that it's just like, uh-oh, like what the heck? Are you going to go more into this?
I'm going to deal with mother, yes, of course. I mean, I'm going to be hitting onto that sometime in after I get to Toronto. I'm going to start dealing with her decline and then going into her life and eventually her death as well. So yeah, that's an important section of the book still to come, without a doubt.
Would a,
And father to some degree, but mostly mother.
would a collection like this have like a notes section where you explain things further?
No, no. Unlike Chester, I like to just put
Yeah.
the work out. Yeah.
And what's part of Nothing Lasts are you going to cover? I should have ran. You're going to rewrite that story.
No, that won't enter in. I don't even think that'll come up. You know, I never even thought about it. It's funny. Um, it's like such a non-event in my life now. I was beaten up a few times in the early '80s. I seriously doubt any of that will enter into the story because they're just such non. It's not important. When I think back, it's funny. You know, when I do think I divide my life up based on where I lived and who my girlfriend was. The relationships with women are enormously important in my mind.
Were you one of those guys who always had a girlfriend?
Pretty much. I mean, I had some periods where I was single, but not very long. I was definitely always looking for another girlfriend.
And were the girlfriends ever weirded out, like when you bring them back to your apartment, they see like the Seth world, where they would you ever get like reactions like, "What the hell is going on here?"
My wife was a little perplexed. Tanya didn't really know what to make of any of this stuff when uh, we first got together. She was kind of pretending that she had a clue what was going on, but as we've talked about it over the years, she just like was just had no context of what all this stuff was, what I was about.
Yeah, did she have a? Because your wife is very stylish, and did she have that style when you met her? Did she have her own individual?
No, she was very stylish, but she was much more like a kind of, you know, a post-punk gothy kind of look.
Oh wow.
Um, and she sort of and believe it or not, I certainly did not remold her into like a vintage clothes person. She followed this thread on her own. And what's interesting is it changed my interest in style, actually. When I met her, I was probably not interested in any clothing after the mid 50s.
Yeah.
And she's primarily interested in clothing from the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
And it kind of like made me reevaluate the clothing from that period. And I must say, I think I like the clothing for women from the late 60s and early 70s the very best. All that bright polyester is extremely appealing.
So one of the questions I have about process is like this, like a cover like this with Palookaville.
Yeah,
Would this have been acetate line work over a painting, or was this one piece?
that's just a straight watercolor painting, that one.
And was that things like this kind of like gradation? Was this just like working wet on wet or something? Like how do you get?
Probably, yeah. I mean, it's been a long time since I did that, but I would imagine I had a kind of a way I would stumble the edge and then get a slightly wetter color in there and fill it. So my main goal back then, when I was learning to use color, learning to use watercolor and Dr. Martin's, was how do you get a perfectly flat tone?
Yeah.
And so most of my technique was simply quickness. How quickly can you get the tone down before it starts drying? So you always have to have a leading edge So if
Uh-huh.
you're doing a big area, you had to design it very carefully so that you didn't have two fronts where you're coming around. Oh no. So you'd always be like design it so you're going in one direction
Yeah.
and go all the way around the figure. Now the background's perfectly flat. Every once in a while you'd make a mistake, you design it wrong, and you'd be like, oh my God, I've got to get over here too. And you're working both directions and meeting up the top, and you're like, thank God. Because sometimes once it started drying, you start getting the gradations.
Yeah.
Of course, now I don't care about that at all. Now it's like I have a much looser approach to any kind of color I'm putting down. I like it when it's messy. But back then, like kids today do not understand. Like they've got that computer where you could just drop in a flat tone on anything.
Yeah.
You could not do that. There was just no way to do that back then unless you did complicated series of overlays,
Hmm.
where you really know your color separation. And you couldn't be sending that off to a magazine. You had to have like a professional piece of artwork that could be sent in the mail or FedEx to them for them to photograph. So occasionally I would work with people who would let me do a monotone where I would just do an acetate overlay and paint on this is where the blue goes.
Yeah.
Um, but you couldn't, minute you started getting up to 2 or 3 colors, you were asking way too much of the magazine to put that together for you.
Oh,
So you
okay.
had to have other methods.
And so for this, would you have penciled this on a separate piece of paper and then done the
Yeah.
watercolor and then on top of
Light
that?
box it. Yeah. Yeah. I'd put that watercolor paper over top of my pencils on the light box, ink it, soak it, staple it down to a board, and then paint it on the watercolor paper.
Yeah. So line work is always last or something like
No, the
this.
line work was first.
Oh, really?
The ink was strong enough you could soak the ink and it wouldn't dissolve.
But it's so they're so dark. I mean, it's like the blacks are almost black.
Yeah, I think it's because they had, they were photographing it. I mean, this would go to Drawing Quarterly. I'd send this off to Chris Oliveros, and then he would send it to the printer. The printer would photograph it. And these guys were good. They would make a great color separation. They had like some kind of a rotary drum they would scan things on. It's like I have no idea what was going on, but I'd get back a proof and the blacks would be black. I mean, that's just black ink.
And then for like the logo would be a separate sheet.
Yeah, that would be an overlay. Yeah.
Okay. And you'd say like I want white and then a red on
Yeah.
top of it, double
Yeah.
that.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
stripe on the same layer, same overlay is that?
I think the stripe actually was a piece of paper.
What?
I think it literally was like a piece of red paper stuck on the art.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
And the back cover, that's an overlay.
Nope, that's all hand colored.
What? Even the ink and
Nope, but just very, yeah, just black ink and watercolor. They would do good separation.
you have the originals to
I
this
think
stuff?
Adrian has that one. I think I traded him that like decades ago for a piece of his artwork.
Yeah, I have to see that stuff to fully understand it because I'm from the computer age. So when I look at these things and how you guys were doing these, I'm like, how is that? That's a whole other set of skills that I can't imagine. The
Well, you're lucky you didn't have to develop them. It's a waste of time, to be honest. I mean, it's good. I mean, it's good to know how to do all kinds of things, and it is useful to be able to make physical artwork. If I had to, I could sit down and do like a complicated watercolor painting.
could you
But
still could you
I'm glad that I don't.
could you
Yeah.
still do something that looks like that?
I don't do anything that looks like this anymore. It's like I just don't even work that way. That actually is just a painting. I look at that now and I think like, what a crazy design to put that dark purple all the way around. That was like it was a lot of work to get it to work out right. But you also have a weird confidence when you're young. I wasn't sweating it. I was just like, there's my idea, complete it, and there it is.
Yeah.
I'd be like giving a lot more thought to what the cover is, and some of those early covers to me, I look at them, and besides not liking them anymore, I'm just perplexed at like the design choices.
Oh, they're so beautiful though, Seth. Like this right here is like classic. Like this dark edge up here. They're
Yeah, well, I mean, that I did plan. I knew I'd have to drop the type over it, but yeah, I look at that and I just remember how I couldn't get the figure right. It drives me crazy.
in what way? Could you
I
had
must have done it 100 times. I mean, look at the weird proportions I was using then, those tiny feet. I remember struggling to make the knees and the legs look right because they're so strangely out of proportion.
this is a classic comic book to me. I love that issue. That's great.
Right.
And that whole story, that's like one of my favorite books of yours. Like I
I
must,
can't even look at that book.
oh man, I've reread it probably 15 times at this point over the
That
years.
book is filled to me with like youth. Like I read it, if I were to read it. I mean, I'll flip through it sometimes for some reason, and I'll be like, I was a young man when I did this book, and it feels young to me.
Yeah. Well, it's one of the ones that I think I spent most of my career ripping off was that.
Well, that's very kind of you. Although I never, with your, the thing I've always liked about, you right out of the mark, you were kind of yourself. You've grown, of course, but you've always had like your style and your voice was right there.
Do you have that Dan Clowes artist edition book that Fantagraphics put out that has like his original artwork?
I do not.
It has overlays. It has like it shows you like how he would do his color.
Okay.
And that when I look at that, I'm just like, even though he's not, painting things the way that you were, just cutting out these little acetate colors to get
Oh
the.
yeah. No, that stuff's a nightmare. Actually, he was painting some of the stuff. Like when you look at some of
Oh,
those later issues of Eight Ball, there's hand painted comics in there for sure.
you and
Yeah.
Maurice Bellacoop had you guys were in your own league as far as colors go. But
I was very influenced by Maurice because he really did. And still, I look at the capability that Maurice has to paint in watercolor in comics is mind boggling.
amazing.
Yeah.
Have you seen anything from his book he's working on from Pantheon?
I've just seen a few images. I haven't read the book yet.
Yeah.
It's coming soon, though. I think it'll be out in the spring.
Is it in color?
It's all color,
Oh my
all
god.
hand painted.
Oh my god. Yeah, I can't wait for that. That one's high on my list. I can't wait to see that. So when you were doing George Sprott, there was no plan to collect that stuff in a book. You were just doing it for the New York Times to serialize it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I started to think about collecting in the book after it was done. I mean, I knew I was going to put it somewhere. I thought it would just be in, an art book or something in the future because I wasn't going to throw it out after it had been done. But I think the idea to make it into an actual book may have come. Maybe Tom Devlin asked me if there was any way to do it. I can't remember now, but it was not part of the intention when I was working on it. That was just get the work done.
Yeah. And then after you had to look at it for a book, like to collect it into a book, you were like, there's a lot of pacing problems here, or
It's just basically like, well, I knew I was, when I was working on it. No, it's funny, you take on certain pieces to do, and they turn out to be important for you. And George Sprott was important for me because it was a transitional work. I'd just done Wimbledon Green, I think, in my sketchbook before it. And so it opened the door to me to the idea of telling a story in segments. Instead of, if I'd not done Wimbledon Green, I might have done one of those kind of things where at the end of each one it said continued next week. And it was just one continuous story, which is, I think, kind of a bad method for those kind of projects. It's like I wanted it to be each installment. You could read it on its own, and maybe you would be a bit perplexed, but it would be self contained.
yeah,
And so that came directly out of having done Wimbledon Green, knowing I could do things in little chapters. But when I worked on it, it became very apparent, like that I would have loved to have had like twice as much space. Um, when I would go, I was writing it in a hotel at that point. I would go to a hotel and I would sit down and I would write like two or three of them, and then I would come home and draw them. And when I would write them, I would just write exactly what I wanted the story, the one pager to be, and then I would figure out, I'd break it down and see how many panels that was. And each time it would be like, it's 150 panels. And I'd be like, well, so that's not going to work. So then I would brutally edit it down to the bone. And then it would be like, I don't know, 40 panels. And so I realized and it was a very good exercise in editing. It taught me a lot. I mean, I threw out 90% of the story.
Hmm.
And I can't even remember what I threw out now. It's all gone in my mind. I'm sure it's still in the notes, but then after that, I just knew there's more I can do, but I don't want to do it by just adding in a bunch more of those stories.
yeah,
I added in a couple extra pages that weren't in the Times in the same format, but mostly what I added in were those 3-page little vignettes where it's told in sepia tone, and that was because I just thought I need to do something different, but adds a bit more depth to the character of George. And I was just fleshing him out a bit. I knew that it would be a mistake to suddenly try and reshape it into a whole new book. At that point, I'd be like, there's no point in me doing it then.
Yeah.
So it was a project. It was a project that came together and became something else than I planned. But in the end, I was actually happy with what it became. It's like I liked the quality of it at the end, that it is something you just sort of put together yourself when you read it.
Yeah, I wonder about like if after you're done with all the original stuff and then it's over in the New York Times and you've moved on and you're doing other work, then you go like Tom Devlin says, let's put it into a book. You have to then revisit that world again. Isn't that a little bit like, oh, it just feels like a slog, especially if you have to do the same, the same tightness, do like basically more strips that would have fit in just
Yeah, no, I couldn't have gone back, and it was, yeah, I'd moved on from it. But I was still interested in enough to see, like, what interested me at that point was not maybe so much the story of George Sprott, but the exercise of how does this become a book.
yeah.
That's why the book is very designy. It's big. I've got the cardboard buildings in it. I've got the big spreads and stuff. To some degree, it might just look like I'm padding out the story. But for me, what I was really interested in was how I was structuring those pages into a bigger book. And in the end, I've forgotten, it seems weird to me when I look at the Times version and think like, well, it's too skimpy now.
Yeah, I have them here. I saved every
Oh, that's great.
I've got all the Times versions and I have the book version of it. I did the same thing. When I did the Joseph Smith book, I did a lot of pages that are just full page drawings of the environment that these things are
Yeah,
happening, landscapes and things like that. And it's not to pad out the story. It's to constantly reinforce the setting, to
yeah,
build the world out so that like you really.
super important.
And the other part of that for a book like that was to be like, okay, well, here's God's perspective on everything. And
Yeah,
here we are in the sky, we're looking down on this stuff as it's happening, and just to constantly go back because that's what that book is basically about. He has to be a character in this somehow.
yeah. I feel like the reader may not always understand these kind of things, but they're there for a reason that gets through somehow. Like when you're talking about God's perspective, I'm not sure you can expect the reader to actually say like, "Oh, this is God's perspective." But if you do that consistently through the book, it gets in there somehow.
Mhm.
I believe that. That's why you do it.
And that's why you would do like in George Sprott the book, like the actual houses, have photographs of the buildings and things like that.
Yeah, I
Part of
feel like you get a kind of a Gestalt experience. At the end of something, it's like the reader is not required to pick the book apart later, and it's a mistake to assume readers will ever do that. They'll read it and they'll either enjoy it or they won't. I mean, they'll write a review on Goodreads where they say like, this was so boring or whatever. That's a reader who just didn't enjoy it. And the person who loved it will say like, oh, it was great. I thought it was a masterpiece, but they're not going to analyze it either.
yeah,
But what does happen is that if you've done the book right, in quotes, um, you will impart some kind of experience to the reader that either they like or they don't like.
Mhm.
And the technique of how you do it is super important, but you can't expect them to waste any time studying how the book was constructed.
Yeah. Have you when you leave a project like that or like Clyde fans, do you feel like I don't want to? Okay, I'm done with that, and you just keep moving forward, like you don't. And
Yeah.
going back and thinking about it is like almost like I don't. It's like painful, or
Yeah.
there's.
Yeah. No, there's no point in looking back at that stuff. It's like it will only be full of things you would do differently.
Yeah,
Um, I mean, there is a good experience too. There's parts that you like, where you think like, oh, that I did that pretty good. Or sometimes you look back at your old drawing and you're like, I could draw better back then than I can draw now. Or you gain things as you get older, and you lose things too.
yeah.
Um, and so it's always an experience when you look back at old work and see like that it's done by somebody else. When I put Clyde Fans together, there were a few pages that I wanted to correct, and it was incredibly difficult to try and imitate the drawing from those old pages. There was a couple of panels I slightly altered from the first section of Clyde, and I couldn't do it. I could not create a believable inked line to match and I literally Xeroxed a panel and cut it apart and used pieces to like to make it work because it was like it was too glaringly obvious. It was like, you know, it would be like I was trying to imitate another artist.
Yeah, I read an interview with you where you're talking about there was a page in the serialized version of Clyde Fans which you went back and rewrote for the first book version of it because of Chester. Chester told you like it's kind of hammering the point. Uh,
Yeah,
these people are too much dialogue and
Chester is always a very good critic. He's
yeah,
usually right.
yeah. Well, that's a good point too, though. Like when you're making comics, you have to remember that your audience is not stupid. You don't need to keep hammering things.
No.
You know, especially if you're a good enough cartoonist, they'll pick up what's happening on their own.
Yeah. I think the thing as you get older, one of the things you do learn, and that's why looking back on old work is difficult, is you do learn to trust the audience more and to be subtler, to
Mm.
try and not hit people over the head with stuff. I mean, when you watch a movie or read a book or a comic or something where it's kind of naively done, that's one of the things that like gets on your nerves is like where you feel a lack of sophistication or trust in the person who's doing it, and you know you want to try and get away from that.
Subtlety, you know, that's a big learning curve, I think, for cartoonists. And
Oh yeah, it's not a subtle medium. Yeah, the book I'm working on right now, I feel that like it's funny how well I think that part of it is you lie to yourself too. There's a very funny like you work on it and you're like this is the greatest comic ever made. Like when people finally see this, they'll be like, people will be saying like, "There's no point in making graphic novels anymore. This is the best one." But then, you know, it's funny. After a couple of years, it's like that's gone. It's like, well, you know, maybe the next book.
it's always maybe the next book.
It's really funny. Like, you know, people will say like, do you ever try to calculate a book that would be popular?" And I was, you know, the thing is, a, of course, I do not. Um, but I wouldn't even know how.
Mhm.
It's like, how could you have any confidence to come up with an idea that you think would be like a bestseller? I can't even imagine. It's like maybe if you started out thinking that way, you would develop a sense for it or a way to approach it. But at this point, well, for it's too late. I don't even understand the culture anymore, so it'd be impossible to figure it out. So now it's the exact opposite. I feel that great freedom of you just do whatever you think. It's like that will be a good book if you think it's good.
Yeah, that's right. And I don't think anything that has become a mega hit was designed necessarily to become like, you know, Diary of a Wimpy Kid is like the biggest thing.
Yeah.
And I mean, I know Charlie, the editor of that, they didn't know it was going to be a big
Yeah.
hit. It's just one of those things that happens, you know?
Yeah, it's very hard to calculate its success. It must happen every once in a while. But for the most part, it's the exact opposite, just like you said. Somebody did something and it becomes an enormous hit, and then people try to imitate it.
Yeah. And it's not, somebody told me this and I think about it a lot now. It's like, it doesn't matter if you're a genius. Like genius doesn't matter. You have to be a genius at just the right time, you know?
That's pretty true. Yeah, that's funny, but very true.
So how many more chapters of Nothing Lasts do you have planned?
I don't know. I know where it ends. I'm not going to write much more than like into my early 30s.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so I know where it'll end. But getting to there, it's hard to say. Each section gets a little longer. I get a little slower on giving more detail. So I'm thinking I must be about 200 pages in now, maybe close to it.
Yeah.
So I figure maybe another 200, something like that.
What
We'll
do you feel
see.
about the colors? Because every paint color on each chapter is different. It's like a different tone.
It's all, it'll all get, I'm sure when the time comes, I'll get Tracy to like equalize all the colors, but they're hand painted on. So it's just, you know, whatever comes out on I'm working with a certain blue and it varies. And we'll do some color correcting,
Is it
make the whole thing look the same.
it's just ink? It's not paint.
Just ink and gouache.
Oh, okay, okay.
So I put the blue down first,
Hmm.
and then I draw over top, or not even ink. I draw with markers. It's beautifully quick. You know, like I can probably, you know, I probably the inking takes like an hour or something. You know, it's nothing. It's like, if that. Um, if I was working on it every day and just churning it out, I mean, I would have it done in, a few months. It wouldn't take any time at all. It's the fact that I probably won't get back to it till like, next May or something. And then I'll sit down for 2 months and do another 40 pages.
Because of the other book that you're working on?
Yeah, I've got everything's broken down into like, like right now I'm working on these paintings. And when they're done, hopefully I'll make some money from that. So that's why I'm doing it. And then the minute I've done these paintings in another week, it's back to that graphic novel, which I hope to work on for 3 months. And that really depends on like what comes in the door during that time too. If somebody like calls up, if the New York Times or the New Yorker calls me, I'll say yes. And then I'll lose, a few days or whatever, maybe a week. But then as soon as like we get into the new year, I've got like certain projects that I have to do. Like I've got these ghost books I do every year. And so those have to be designed. I have to do those covers. That'll eat up 3 weeks. Then I'll try to get back to the graphic novel before I have to do the interiors of those. So, so it's all a matter of shuffling this. And then there's some magazine covers I do regularly during this period. The thing is, like people don't, it's like, oh, a magazine cover, what's that? Well, it's a week.
Yeah.
You spend a couple of days drawing it, then you spend a couple of days inking it and doing the colors. And then, you deal with the production art. And before you know it, you've lost a week. So it's like, it's constantly a battle of getting back to the work that counts.
So you're still doing the haunted library
Yep.
project?
Yep. Every year, 3 of them. And every year I'll pick up some other projects that kind of just accumulate. Like I'm doing 2 Doug Wright books this year. So that adds up. I lost a
What's
month.
the
I
other
lost,
book you're doing?
pardon me?
I know about the
You
collector.
know about that. You wrote the intro.
Yeah. What about the other one? What's the other one?
The other one's going to be, should I talk about it? Maybe I shouldn't because I haven't talked to the publisher about whether I'm allowed to talk about it.
Okay. Okay.
But it's another collection of Doug Wright.
Will you tell me if it's drawn quarterly?
No, it's not.
Oh, okay.
It's
Uh,
somebody else. If it was drawn in quarterly, I'd just talk about it because I'm sure they'd be fine.
is your new book with drawn quarterly that you're working on?
No, I mean this book will be when I'm done it, but that'll still be a couple of years. This big graphic novel, but
Okay.
there'll probably be another Palookaville within a year and a half or something. I mean, as soon as I finish the next Nothing Lasts, I'll probably construct another Palookaville out of it. So, and then it will depend on their schedule when they plug it in. I mean, I've always got tons of stuff that I can throw in there, so I'm not worried. I might do another sketchbook section, or I've been doing a ton of work in ceramic with the ceramic artist I work with. Or I might show off some of that. Who knows?
And then, is there going to be like an Art of Seth book or something at some point?
It's on the list. There are 5 books that I have to do before I'm dead. And it's like literally, it's like this graphic novel is book 1. Then I'm going to do that Art of Seth book.
Mhm.
Then I've got like a children's book I really want to do that I've been putting off for years. And then then Nothing Lasts has to be finished. And then there's like a final graphic novel in my mind, like that I've planned that in case I get no other work done after that, like which kind of is a summing up. What I always think about is Matisse. Matisse, he was 80 years old when he did the first cutouts. When he did those cutouts, he said to himself, I finally figured out like what I want to do with my art. This was it. I wasted all those years painting. And so for 10 years, he did those cutouts and he designed that chapel, stained glass, and it's his best work for me. I love that work. And he did that between 80 and 90. So it's something to aim for if you live that long. I mean, Joe Matt just dropped dead.
No. Yeah.
And he was 60 years old. So you're not guaranteed any time.
No.
Yeah, I used to laugh at the old cartoonists with their sore backs, but I'm not laughing now.
Hey man, I'm gonna let you go. I took more time than I
That's
expected.
okay.
Yeah, I'm really sorry about that. But I could talk to you. I could
No,
talk.
I like talking to you, and I wish you lived closer.
Hey, one other question I wanted to ask you about, which I should have asked in the beginning, is: have you always worked in a basement?
Yes. Well, no, I mean not in Toronto, not when I lived in Toronto because I lived in an apartment.
Mhm.
So, but the minute I had a house, it's the basement. I
Yeah.
love the basement.
You love the basement. What about like flooding? Has that ever happened?
It did in the old house I lived in, but not in this one. This one's bone dry. Plus, the house is on a hill, so drainage all down. We had a pipe burst a couple of years ago, and all the water went into the neighbor's house. It's a bit embarrassing, but I was grateful it didn't go into my studio.
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's everything. And so it's a cement floor down there.
It's yeah, it's a cement floor, but I've got wood over top of it.
Okay, and no silverfish or anything down there that eat artwork.
Nothing. No, it's great. No, it's a very dry basement, not damp at all.
It's
It's
warm.
it's actually pretty warm, although I have a heater behind me for the winter. Well,
So
Chris Rea told me years ago, he said, where you work, like whether you work in the basement or the attic, he said, if you work in the basement, you're a mama's boy. And if you work in the attic, then you're like daddy's boy. But I don't, that's funny because Chris works in the attic.
yes,
And I do not think of Chris as a daddy's boy.
Harvey Kurtzman worked in the attic too.
Okay.
You can
The
handle.
attic is a different perspective, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Especially if you're looking out the window in the attic, which I'm pretty sure Chris is.